Okay, the early 90s perspective. Here's what's going on for this particular class. We have 3 readings. Each reading addresses an issue from the early 90s involving the U.S., the United Nations, and what would eventually become bin Laden's organization, Al Qaeda. You want to think about the questions that are being asked here, and for the most part, you have a reading, and then you have a sheet, and so everybody has the same reading, the same question sheet, and then the readings are different. So each student should get a reading, and then you're going to pretty much share the information and try to answer the questions and see, what impact the early 90s has. So we have 3 events that are taking place: the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the Oslo Accords, and the United Nations sanctions on Iraq. Those are the 3 readings, and those are the items that are addressed in those readings. So here's what we know. We know that in the early 90s, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. This creates a situation in Saudi Arabia where they start to panic. We know that Mecca and Medina are located in Saudi Arabia. And we know that the United States is going to work with the United Nations to send a military force into the region so they could force Saddam's military out of Kuwait because they're not going to stand for an attack. So that's what's going on here. This, of course, is going to anger bin Laden, who is going to argue that if anybody is going to defend places where Mecca and Medina are located, it would have to be Muslims and not the United States, not a Western military. This is sacred land for Muslims, and they are the ones that need to go about defending the region. So the readings address 3 particular items that were addressed before. And let's take a look at some of these items. The first item is looking at the coalition that was created to deal with the invasion of Kuwait, which is addressed right here. August 2nd, 1990, there's going to be an invasion. George Bush is president of the United States, and he has to respond to this situation. So what do? They get a coalition, and the coalition is going to go to the region, United Nations, and they are going to deal with the situation. And so that's kind of where this particular reading is at. It addresses, what happens during the conflict, which is right here. They do not take Saddam Hussein out of power. They do, however, deal with the invasion of Kuwait. So the questions here: what impact could the event have on U.S. foreign policy? Well, it seems like the United States has taken initiative to get involved in the region. How do you think bin Laden could exploit the situation outlined in your article? I mean, this could be various answers for this one, but when we look at his fatwa, we know that bin Laden uses the Iraq war, as he says right here, the continued aggression against the Iraqi people. He also says that we are using the peninsula as a staging post. And so those are some of the arguments that he is going to use to suggest why he's justified for his 98 fatwa. Let's move on now to the next reading. The next reading is about the Oslo Accords. So in the Oslo Accords, as it tells you up top, this is taking place in 93. Let's see, decades-old fighting between them, hesitation on both sides. So this is really to look at the Israeli and Palestinian issue, which have been at odds since the end of World War II. And so what's at stake here? They're looking at land territory, and they're having this meeting and trying to figure out a way to resolve the issue. Keep in mind, the United States did get involved in trying to broker some peace, and that did take place in the 1970s. And there seems to still be tension from 70s up until the point where the Oslo Accords are taking place. So we kind of want to go back to those same questions over here. What impact could your event have on U.S. foreign policy? Again, the United States seems to be getting involved. How can bin Laden exploit the situation? He is probably going to say this is an example of Christians in Israel, the Jewish people working in an alliance against Muslims. And of course, that is going to depend on which one is getting the short end of the stick with regard to the negotiations that are going to be determined. So should the UN get involved? I guess that's questionable, but they're not. The US already is getting involved. And how is bin Laden going to exploit the situation? Well, let's take a look. When we look at his fatwa, he does bring up the Crusader Zionist Alliance. He does seem to be concerned about the Palestinian people. And so that's kind of where he's going with that. So there's going to be a lot at stake with regard to this particular negotiation that's taken place. Let's take a look at the next reading, which is going to be about Iraqi sanctions. So the Iraqi sanctions, in order to understand this one, you have to know that this is after the invasion of Kuwait and after the United Nations has, with the U.S.-led military, has declared, a victory over forcing Saddam Hussein's military back into Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait, which they mentioned right here. So this one is about the Oil for Food program, and the Oil for Food program is a way to get oil from Iraq in exchange for food. So they're putting sanctions on Iraq, and the sanctions are going to be designed to restrict trade with Iraq. So what exactly does that mean? That means if there are sanctions, it's going to be a little more difficult for you to get resources and sell items to Iraq, as well as their ability to get the item out. But we know that Iraq has oil, so the Food for Oil program is designed as a way to get oil from Iraq, which is a definite resource needed within the global community, and it's designed to get them what they need. So that's kind of what's going on here in this section right here. So what does bin Laden say about the Food for Oil program? He looks at the issue that we dictate to its rulers. He then goes on to say, despite the huge amount which has exceeded 1 million, he does look at a lot of items that he feels is responsible for the killing of not just Iraqis, but people in general. So his argument is going to be that the sanctions are killing Iraqis. When we look at the sheet here, should the UN get involved? Looks like the UN is already involved, and do what? I don't know what your thought is about the Food for Oil program. Should the US get involved? How is bin Laden going to exploit the situation? We kind of already addressed that item. So what do we know? We know that Iraq invaded Kuwait, and we know that the United Nations was involved. So let's take a look at this sheet here, which is simply looking at some UN resolutions. So when we're looking at this one here, we want to take note of the resolutions. Here we see resolution 660, 664, 660, 78, and they pretty much just go on to deal with the invasion. So here it says that the United Nations condemns the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. They are demanding the Iraq withdrawal. That's this item. Notice the dates. This is August 2nd going to August 18. Here they're talking about another departure from Kuwait, resolution 678. This one is November of 90. And again, it looks back, comply fully with resolution 660. So here they're saying you need to comply with this one here. And keep in mind, this is all going to be up to Iraq, Saddam Hussein, to determine whether or not they're going to actually follow what's presented here. And here we have more of the items as far as additional resolutions that are taking place. So for the most part, it's the United Nations trying to demand enforcement of the resolutions that they're passing. And again, those are the issues that are at stake here, which is why I wanted you to complete those 3 readings to get an understanding of the role of the early 90s with regard to the U.S. presence in the Middle East after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq.